I had always been an ordinary office worker, consumed by spreadsheets and deadlines. My mornings started with the hum of my alarm clock, followed by a hurried breakfast of toast and coffee as I rushed to catch the bus. At the office, the hours were marked by the clatter of keyboards, the murmur of meetings, and the familiar faces of colleagues who, like me, were trapped in the monotony of daily grind. Evenings were spent catching up on emails or watching reruns of old shows, a quiet, predictable life that gave no warning of the chaos to come. My days passed in a routine blur, with little hint of the horrors that would soon unfold. When the first reports of a mysterious outbreak appeared on the news, I barely paid attention. Another distant crisis, I thought, the kind that dominated headlines for a week before fading into obscurity. But within days, it was clear this was different. Entire regions fell silent. Governments stammered through press conferences, their assurances thin and unconvincing. Then the infection reached our city. It began with whispers of strange incidents, ambulances speeding through the streets, rumors of people collapsing in public without explanation. By the next day, hospitals were overrun, and social media flooded with frantic videos of the sick behaving erratically, their faces pale and eyes glazed. Soon, the news channels switched to continuous coverage, showing panicked crowds trying to escape infected zones. The infection wasn't just spreading, it was consuming everything in its path. The city, once alive with the hum of daily life, descended into chaos overnight. I remember the night the sirens began. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert, warning us to stay indoors. But the panic was already spilling into the streets. People fled in every direction, their cars crammed with hastily gathered belongings. Grocery shelves emptied in hours. By the time I understood the gravity of the situation, it was nearly too late. My family and I piled into our car and drove to the only place we thought might be safe, an old Cold War-era bunker my grandfather had built decades ago. It had always been a curiosity, something we joked about during family gatherings. Now, it was our last hope. We reached the bunker as chaos consumed the city. I spun the heavy metal wheel on the door, sealing us inside. The final click echoed through the narrow corridor, a sound that felt both comforting and suffocating. My wife, my younger brother, and I stood in silence, the weight of what we'd done sinking in. Outside, the world crumbled. Inside, we began a new, claustrophobic reality. The first few days were a blur of adjustments. The initial shock of sealing ourselves inside gave way to a cascade of practical challenges. Simple tasks like setting up sleeping arrangements or deciding how to allocate personal space turned into heated discussions. The air, thick and stale despite the filtration system, clung to us like an invisible weight, amplifying every breath and movement. The hum of the generator became both a lifeline and an irritant, its constancy reminding us of the fragility of our situation. Every time I inventoried the supplies, canned food, water reserves, medical kits, I couldn't help but calculate and recalculate how long they might last. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by nightmares or the occasional creak of metal, each sound triggering a wave of unease. Adapting wasn't just about survival, it was about finding a way to exist in a space that seemed to shrink with every passing hour. The bunker, though sturdy, was not meant to be lived in for long. The air smelled stale despite the filtration system. Every sound, the hum of the generator, the creak of metal, felt amplified in the confined space. We inventoried our supplies, canned food, water reserves, medical kits. If we rationed carefully, we might last a few months. That knowledge did little to ease my anxiety. The ticking clock of our resources loomed over every decision. Through an old radio system, we picked up faint broadcasts from the outside world. The voices were fragmented, their desperation cutting through the static. One broadcast described military barricades being overrun, the infected swarming like a tide no weapon could hold back. Another was a chilling plea, a woman begging for help, her voice trembling as she described being trapped in a high-rise building surrounded by the infected. Sometimes, there were bursts of coded messages, quick and indecipherable, hinting at operations far beyond our comprehension. Each transmission was a grim reminder of the world falling apart, yet they tethered us to the hope that some order, any order, might still exist. At first, there were fragmented reports of quarantine zones and military efforts to contain the outbreak. But the news grew bleaker with each passing day. Cities fell one by one. The infected, they said, were relentless. I clung to the static-laced voices like a lifeline, even as hope dwindled with every word. Tensions inside the bunker rose quickly. My younger brother and I had always clashed over small things, but those old grievances now resurfaced with new intensity. He accused me of always trying to control everything, a jab that stung because it wasn't entirely untrue. My wife, caught in the middle, tried to mediate but only grew more exasperated as arguments flared over the smallest issues, like how long to run the generator or who should monitor the radio. The close quarters made every irritation magnified tenfold, and the lack of a clear end to our confinement left tempers on edge. The bunker walls seemed to absorb our frustration, only to echo it back at us. My younger brother, always headstrong, questioned my decisions at every turn. He accused me of hoarding supplies, of mismanaging our rations. His frustration simmered, spilling into heated arguments that echoed through the narrow corridors. I tried to stay calm, to be the steady hand we all needed, but the strain was unbearable. The bunker's walls seemed to press closer with every argument. Late one night, the radio crackled to life with a voice we didn't recognize. The man claimed to be a lone survivor with knowledge of a rumored safe zone. His words were faint, barely audible through the static, but they ignited a spark of hope. My brother argued that we should contact him, try to find this sanctuary. But I couldn't shake the fear that it might be a trap, a desperate ploy by someone who had nothing left to lose. In the end, I chose caution, a decision that left me racked with guilt. One evening, the generator sputtered and died, plunging us into total darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our panicked breaths. I fumbled for a flashlight, my hands shaking as I checked the fuel lines. Fixing the generator felt like a race against my own fear, a desperate attempt to hold our fragile world together. When the lights flickered back on, I saw the relief on my wife's face. But the darkness had left its mark, a lingering reminder of how precarious our situation was. While searching for spare parts to prevent another power failure, I stumbled upon a hidden compartment in the bunker. My grandfather, a man of few words but meticulous habits, had built the bunker during the height of Cold War paranoia. He'd once told me stories about how he had feared nuclear fallout, spending years preparing for a catastrophe he prayed would never come. This compartment, locked and concealed so well I'd never noticed it before, must have been his secret backup plan. Inside, I found a cache of old military gear, meticulously packed rations, and a single hazmat suit. It was a revelation that spoke of his foresight but also deepened the mystery of his preparations. What had he expected, and why had he kept this hidden even from us? The discovery felt like a lifeline and a warning all at once. It was a small, locked room I'd never noticed before. With some effort, we pried it open, revealing a cache of old military gear and a single hazmat suit. My grandfather's secret stockpile raised more questions than answers. Why had he hidden this? What had he prepared for? The discovery was both a blessing and a burden, adding another layer of uncertainty to our fragile existence. The radio broadcasts grew less frequent, then stopped entirely. When the static finally faded to silence, it was as if the last thread connecting us to the outside world had been severed. We sat together in the dim bunker light, the weight of the silence pressing on us. My wife broke the stillness, whispering that maybe the broadcast stopping meant there was no one left to send them. My brother, always the optimist, countered that it could mean survivors had regrouped elsewhere. I couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, I stared at the radio, grappling with the idea that we might truly be alone, and that the world above had moved past salvation. The silence was worse than the grim news had been. It felt as if the world had finally fallen completely apart. My brother became increasingly restless, pushing for us to leave the bunker and search for survivors. He argued that staying meant certain death, that we were wasting time and resources hiding underground. I wanted to believe him, to take that leap of faith, but the thought of stepping outside filled me with dread. Then came the night someone tried to breach the bunker. The sound of scraping metal echoed through the corridors, each noise sharp and jarring. My heart raced as I grabbed a makeshift weapon, standing guard with my brother near the door. We barely breathed, every nerve on edge. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped, but the psychological toll lingered. The idea that the infected, or desperate survivors, were so close shook me to my core. With our supplies dwindling and hope fading, I made the hardest decision of my life. We couldn't stay in the bunker any longer. I volunteered to use the hazmat suit to scout the outside world, to see if there was any chance of survival beyond these walls. As I suited up, my wife's eyes brimmed with tears. My brother's face was a mask of determination, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I stepped out into the daylight, the first I'd seen in weeks. The city was unrecognizable. Streets were littered with abandoned cars and debris. Windows were shattered, and silence hung heavy in the air. I saw no sign of the infected, but the absence of life was equally haunting. Then, in the distance, I found tire tracks leading out of the city. They were fresh enough to give me hope, proof that someone else had survived and fled. I returned to the bunker and gathered my family. We packed what little we could carry and prepared to leave. As we stepped out into the unknown, I glanced back at the bunker one last time. It had been our refuge, our prison, and our salvation. Now, it was a relic of a world we could no longer inhabit. We followed the tracks, driven by the faint hope of finding others, of finding safety. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like we were moving towards something instead of waiting for the end.